Behind me, that's a very famous building, the Syracuse University Carrier Dome, home of some great teams and great athletes. It's also the home of a record-breaking wind less than 2 years ago, a wind of 105 miles an hour. And even though it's relative quiet,
that's when I scaled to the top of the Carrier Dome to report on that extreme wind. Now that wind wasn't with a severe thunderstorm or tornado. Here's what happened on that windy night, January 17th, 2012. The time was 10:40 p.m. A cold front had just gone by, and the winds had shifted into the northwest. Colder air was rushing in. That's when the anemometer, 164 feet up on top of the dome, measured a gust of 105 miles an hour. The previous record for the dome was 78 miles an hour. Not even close. So how does that 105 mile an hour wind compare to other exceptionally strong winds we've had here in central New York in the past, or compared to actual storms? Well, that 105 mile per hour gust is pretty much in the ballpark of what the peak winds were estimated to be for the infamous Labor Day storm of '98. A 105 mile per hour wind also rates about the same as an EF1 tornado or a Category 2 hurricane. If you want to compare to the official National Weather Service records, the highest wind on record for Syracuse is 77 miles per hour in, guess what? The infamous Labor Day storm of '98. The second highest wind on record was 63 miles per hour in October 1954.
Now here in central New York, and especially on top of the Carrier Dome at 164 feet up, I think we have pretty much realized it can get pretty windy here, especially on top of the dome. But 105 mile an hour wind, like what happened here early last year, well, that's something extra special. That's something different. It's not just the weather, but it's also physics. Let me tell you a little bit about that.
We probably also realize that if you go 164 feet up on top of the Carrier Dome, it's even more windy. But a 105 mile per hour wind like last year, well, that's something special. That's not just Mother Nature. So let me explain the physics of how that happened. Winds blow up and over the top of the dome. Air is compressed, and as it's compressed, the speed of the air increases. It's estimated the actual wind speed was 60 to 70 miles per hour. As a matter of fact, at the same time the Carrier Dome anemometer recorded that 105 mile an hour wind gust, Hancock Airport winds peaked at 63 miles an hour. Now, the biggest factor for that 105 mile per hour wind is the shape of the dome. With that fast flowing air compressing over the top, the effective wind speed increased to 105 miles an hour.
Well, I think we'd all agree a 100 mile an hour wind is unusual for here in Syracuse and central New York, and we could argue it's sort of unusual anywhere in the world. But it posed some extra problems for the roof of the Carrier Dome. You get a 100 mile an hour wind, and I'll tell you what that did. It nearly lifted the roof right off the top of the dome.
That 105 mile per hour wind gust on top of the Carrier Dome was likely the result of both the weather and the physics of how the Carrier Dome is built. That wind nearly lifted the roof off the dome, literally, thanks to something called the Bernoulli Effect. That's strong winds lowering the air pressure on top of the dome. Recently, I had an opportunity to speak with Pete Sala, Director of Carrier Dome Operations, and we talked about that 105 mile an hour wind.
It's an amazing thing, Wayne, and it's something that we have to train for with our staff in stadium control, because with the shape of the building, when you get that Bernoulli effect, it actually lifts the roof, tries to lift the roof off the building. When that does that, it gives you a false reading of stadium control that the pressure's changing in the building. It actually makes the roof a little, pretend like it's a little lighter, so that you'll get a fluctuation in the building pressure, and you need to understand that and know how to control that.
Strong winds blow up and over the top of the dome, which lowers air pressure just above the dome. Now, what that means is that air pressure becomes higher just below the roof of the dome. Literally, then, the higher air pressure below tries to push the roof off.
So yes, it does get windy here in central New York and Syracuse. But when you're talking about a 100 mile an hour wind, well, that's unusual for almost anywhere. Whether you're talking about 164 feet up on top of the roof of the Carrier Dome, or maybe a derecho, like the infamous Labor Day storm of 1998. And there's only one way to describe a wind like that, and that's extreme wind. Wayne Mahar, CNY Central in Syracuse.